Good afternoon. We're grateful for all you table talkers, and we're actually the ones talking, and you're the ones listening. What we wanted to do over the next couple weeks and during these summer months is talk. And we want to take some time to think about some of the values that we have as a church, but practically speaking, we talk about being biblical, being reverential, being radically generous, being relational, and about being missional. And so over the next 7 weeks, really, we're going to kind of look at some ways that we can practically consider those values. When Paul wrote to the Thessalonians, he said in 1 Thessalonians 2:13, and we also thank God constantly for this, that when you received the word of God, which you heard from us, you accepted it not as the word of men, but what it actually and what it really is, the word of God, which is at work in you believers. So we wanted to take some time today to talk about how do we become people who receive and hear the word of God, specifically in sermons. It's kind of a different thing in our culture. We don't sit around and listen to someone speak for 30, 40 minutes unless it's in another setting. And public speaking has dramatically changed with the advent of the camera and social media. So coming to a Sunday morning requires us to prepare ourselves and to train ourselves to do that. So I wanted to think first about some of the problems, not just the ones that I've mentioned here, but Luke, what would be some of the challenges that people are facing when they're coming on a Sunday morning to listen to the sermon being preached?
Yeah, one challenge that I'm sure many have faced, especially maybe young families, is sort of a distraction and tiredness. It can be very difficult to get a family up in the morning, to get everybody fed and dressed and out the door and into the church. And by the time you get to your seats and by the time the sermon starts, you may find yourself feeling a little frazzled, feeling a little stressed out, and that can be a bit of a challenge and a bit of a barrier to actively engaging then with the preaching of the word. I think that's one major challenge.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and Gary, you and I have had to raise our kids and help them in churches. Other things that are maybe problems or barriers for people when it comes to listening to a sermon.
Yeah, Luke, and it's not just families, of course. I think distractions in general are maybe the number one thing. It could be, what you're going through as an adult in life, whether you're married or not, and in general, distractions. That's a great place to start. But beyond that, I think there is an ongoing cultural narrative that's only growing, not dissipating. That is a skepticism of authority. So, what is authority in our lives? What does that look like? We don't like to submit. That's a human thing, and it's always been that way. But probably writ large in our culture today, and so that already, the posture that we have in church, that a single guy is preaching to the congregation, that immediately has some cultural problems. I think of, we've got, even for us, and we're getting on in age, but, there are people in the congregation older than us that have been Christians maybe almost as long as we've been alive. And certainly for Luke, when he preaches, he's not even out of his 20s yet. And so that and I hope to address that later on. I don't know what questions you're asking, but that would be one issue, I think, is authority. And what right does this person have to speak to me?
Yeah. We face enormous challenges with distractions that can be from other people, the environment we're in, our own inner being, technology, the way that we are training ourselves in our rhythms in a week. If we're tired, if we're hungry, if we didn't have our cup of coffee, if we had too much coffee. There are just a plethora of issues that come up. So we want to think, I want to spend the bulk of our time not on the problems, but on how do we become good listeners of a sermon? Because this really is one of the ways that we as the church are shaped and formed by the Word of God. We're being formed into the image of His Son. We're being shaped together. It's creating a culture. So we want to listen well. And so in light of the distractions that we've got, Luke, what would be some things that you'd say here? Let's just start talking about parents. Parents have got all sorts of challenges with their kids, what are some ways to help families? We'll think about parents first and then kids second, on how they can learn to listen to a sermon.
Yeah, I think there's probably remarkable overlap between what's helpful for parents and what's helpful for kids. But the first thing that comes to my head is that I've heard it said, and I think it's right, that the sermon starts sort of long before the pastor gets up on a Sunday morning to preach that sermon. The thing that's going to be most helpful for anybody, for a parent, a child, or for a family all together is preparation, is to be prepared as you come into a Sunday morning. So that preparation is both a spiritual preparation and also a practical preparation. And both of those sides can really, really help set up any individual or any family for success when the preacher actually gets up and opens his Bible and begins to preach.
Mm-hmm.
So Gary, let's talk a little bit about, as fathers, we've had to bring our families to church. You're a father of 5. I'm a father of 4. Luke, you're a father of 1, a lot younger. What have you done, Gary, to, in the past? What were you doing as preparation before Sunday morning?
Well, it starts really with how you live your life the other 6 days of the week, and what priority do you give to the Word of God. We're a hearing people. Maybe I'll step back and say this. First, we are a hearing people. Like Old Testament, New Testament confirms this. In Deuteronomy, it says, "Hear, O Israel."
Yep.
"Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." Deuteronomy 6:4. And Romans 10:17, we come to faith. It's through hearing the Word of God that we come to faith. And so that should be inculcated in our families. We should be reading the Word of God to our families regularly. I know you're working probably toward that in terms of formulating in your brain. I know, Andrew, you've worked hard at trying to minister, whether it's a round table or a separate time, and we did sort of both. We would train our kids. I can remember going through the Psalms and just encouraging them, take a little card and write something. I wanted them to learn how to interpret and apply the Word of God for themselves. So I wanted, what impacted you the most from this psalm that you read today? And so it's little things like that it's not just building an attention span that may be part of it, but it's really, what do you say in your everyday life about the Word of God? Is it evident that you care about it? Is it evident that it's the rule of authority in your household? Is it evident that it's the lens through which you see and interpret all things in life? These things will speak much louder than, doing some kind of training course to train a 7-year-old how to hear the Word of God. Your actions will speak a lot louder than that.
Yeah, there's the spiritual side that you've so well addressed, Gary. I think, too, thinking about Saturday night, how do you prepare Saturday night for Sunday morning? If your family's getting to bed late and you're planning to come to the 9 o'clock service, you're setting yourself up for all sorts of challenges. So having an adequate routine on a Saturday night, I think it's helping your kids to have the expectation what's going to happen on Sunday morning. We're going to get up, we're going to eat our breakfast, we're going to be out the door by this time. I need you to be dressed and do these things. That always helps.
If I could say one or two more things, like the expectation that you just said is so important. And you read from Thessalonians earlier. 1 Peter 4 talks about all have received a gift. If it's a speaking gift, then that speaker is speaking the oracles of God. That is really weighty. I'm sure all of us feel that if we are getting up on a Sunday morning to preach. I know I do. It's sobering, but that's what God calls this. And if we're to have I was speaking before about having a posture of humility. If you're older today and you sometimes wonder, what does that young whippersnapper there? He's got a little baby. What's he got to say to me? Well, he's got the Word of God to share with you. And when we see Luke, even in his 20s, he's sharing the oracles of God. It's not Luke you're submitting to. It's the Word of God that you're submitting to. It's not the authority of Luke. It's the authority of the Word of God that Luke is preaching. And I could really encourage you to humble yourself, and that will say a lot. You did talk about sort of preparing, but it's the after the fact. Like There's before, during, and after the preach.
Yeah.
That is, all of it is important. And so what do you expect you're hearing when you come to hear a Sunday sermon? How do you speak about it afterward in your home, around the dinner table? Are you honoring the Word of God by what you think about? Like, don't focus on the personality parts. All of us are trying to be better preachers. Even Andrew, you've spent 20 years as a pastor in two different churches where you're the primary speaker on a Sunday. And I know you care about getting better as a preacher. We're all trying. So don't focus on how we conveyed it and delivered it. We're trying our best to do that in a faithful way. But what was shared about? What can you challenge your family with? And that's the after part. We have a responsibility to prepare, and it's a grave responsibility. You have a responsibility once you've heard it for what you've heard.
Yeah.
That's really critically important.
For sure.
Yeah, and doing the practical things will help you. Living out the Word of God, making it a priority in your home, making sure on a Sunday morning, show up on time. I can't tell you how critical that is. If you're feeling rushed, it's going to create a feeling of conflict between family members in your own home. You're going to rush, then you've got to get in, you've got to sit down. If the service has started, there's just a hard shift that you've got to make from rushing to quieting your own heart to receive the Word.
That's great.
And that's so crucial. There are so many dynamics that go on. It's putting your cell phone on vibrate or turning it off. It's making sure that all the details, that your attention span is fixed and focused on gathering and giving God all the praise that He is due. One of the things that I've said to my family is the reason we come on Sunday mornings is Jesus is worthy of our praise. And we ought to give Him praise and worship, and we want to hear His word. So Luke, some of the things that parents will find difficult then is sometimes they've got their kids in the service. We've had kids in the service during the pandemic. It's been wildly awesome. They're on the floors, they're driving cars, they're drawing pictures. And parents have adjusted, I think, really well.
Yeah.
Then there's the transition to helping the kids listen to the sermon. What are some things that we can do to encourage kids as they're listening to the Word of God?
Yeah, I think it's important for kids and frankly also for adults to find a way to be actively engaged in the sermon. It's if you're sitting there, if you're hearing something, but not maybe having some other way of being actively engaged, it can be very difficult to focus and very difficult to remember anything that you've heard. I'm sure all of us, regardless of how old we are, can recall many times when we've sat down and heard a sermon and walked away and not remembered a single word of it. And one thing that I think helps, whether you're a child or an adult, is to take notes, is to actively be looking to find I think how you take notes is just as important as whether you take notes, but to really focus in on maybe the more basic elements. What is the point of this sermon? What is the main drive of this sermon? Really, as an adult and adults then encouraging their children to listen and try to find these main points, try to find what were the 3 points that the pastor gave. What is, as Gary pointed out, maybe what's one way that this can apply to your life? What is one thing that particularly stands out to actively engage, whether or not you're writing with a pen and paper or whether you've got some sort of digital device, is going to make a huge difference for any age, for kids as well as for adults, I would say.
I'd really want to encourage our parents on that line. And I know not every family is as bookish as ours probably are. We had notebooks for each of our kids, and whether it's a crayon or a ballpoint pen, they brought it in there and they took notes. And Andrew, from time to time, you'll encourage them to draw pictures. And if that's what it looks like for your family, for your child at that age, that's great. It does engage them in what's being said, and you'll be shocked. I can think of one congregant who's certainly learning disadvantaged in quite obvious ways, and yet her parents and I am often surprised by what she takes out of a service. So don't underestimate what your kids can do. Really encourage them to engage, and that's a great advice there, Luke.
And I would say as well, one of the things with parents is that we underestimate what our kids can do.
Mm-hmm.
From a very early age, our children have been able to sit in the service. I'm not saying that they're perfect by any means, but we've encouraged them to listen, and they can listen by drawing a picture. A picture and drawing does not distract them necessarily from hearing the word, if provided that it's connected to what we're listening to.
Yeah.
The other thing is, I've never wanted my kids to be silent. If they've got a question and they don't understand something, it's okay for them to ask me the question or my wife the question about what's going on in that moment. And it's okay for you not to get all 30, 35 minutes of the sermon, because you'll get the bulk of the big idea through the points. They're on the PowerPoint. You can see those things generally. But your kids, you're helping them and training them to listen. And so if they've got a question, it's okay to take a moment and quickly answer that question, or to come back and say, you know what, we'll talk about that after the service. And for you to jot down the note about what they asked, and to engage in that on the drive home or around the dinner table afterwards.
Yeah.
What are some other things, Luke? I'm thinking of adults. We've talked a little bit about note taking. That can be, some people find that helpful, some people find that distracting.
Yeah.
So how can note taking be helpful, and what would you recommend people do?
Yeah, absolutely. I have been guilty, I think, in the past of unhelpful note taking. I am whether it was in school or listening to a sermon, my note taking more often than not involved just copying verbatim everything that was said. As somebody who wants to have it all there just in case, that can be unhelpful. That can distract from what you're listening to if you're trying to copy down word for word an entire sermon. Now, most people maybe don't have that tendency as strongly as I do, but I think just one helpful note-taking tip is to keep it very, very simple, is to break it down into main points and these types of things, which as preachers, our aim is to distill things into points specifically for it to be more helpful. So as pastors build their sermons around the main point of a text and then different points of application, I would encourage anybody to use that as the framework for the notes. You don't need to write pages and pages and pages, but to get the general thrust of a passage is important and actually then helpful when you try to go back to it.
Gary, what would you say to the non-note taker, the person who finds it distracting to take a note when they're listening? How could they be encouraged then in listening to the sermon?
Yeah, I guess I would encourage you to at least take down the points. I really do think that's important. It will help you structure your thoughts about the passage. It's you have to trust your pastor has been led in how he's prepared and delivered the sermon. So I can completely understand you not wanting to be a big note taker, and right now we're not handing out bulletins. Yeah. So if we get back to that, then of course it's right on the outline. But if not, then just keep a notebook with you and put down the sermon passage, the title, and the 3 points. And then as you review it afterward, the goal really of our preaching is James 1, right? Like you're not supposed to be just a hearer of the word, you're supposed to be a doer. And so if you're going to be a doer of the word that you've heard, or like I said earlier, you're now responsible for the truth that you've been shared. Well, how are you going to really follow up on that if you really can't assimilate that and formulate that in your brain? What is it that the Lord has asked? What oracle has been shared with you? And if you can't recount that, I'd encourage you to at least take down those points, and then reflect on it and pray about it. I don't know if you're going to ask about what we do after a sermon, but I would encourage people to read the passage again. Take a Sunday afternoon. Be a Berean. The Bereans searched the scriptures to see if what they were taught was true, and in humility, that's what you should be doing with everything that we preach as well.
Yeah, and we're pretty much hitting our 20 minutes here. I just want to add a couple of things. And just to be fully transparent in terms of how I preach, I've always adopted a philosophy of you move from problem to solution, the problem of sin to the solution of Christ. So from my introduction, you'll get a sense of the problem and the problem, how it's affecting our lives in some sort of practical illustration or example. The solution will be the doctrine that I'm working towards. The points will be applicational. What are the things that you can be thinking about and doing? And then the rest of the sermon is filling out those things. It's a very basic framework by which I've tried to preach over the last probably 7 or 8 years. And it's kind of where I've hit my stride. I'd encourage you afterwards to be involved with a life group. Get involved, and as you get involved in a life group, our life groups are often connecting with the sermon throughout the week. And because of that, it reinforces what was learned on a Sunday and how can I apply it. Questions I have, I can ask those to others. And by the way, you can always ask us. Just because the person standing at the front is proclaiming the oracles of God, it does not mean we're infallible. This is the infallible word. And so there are times where I've been corrected, and I receive that with joy, and it's always good when I'm corrected in a way that shows that the person has been humbly listening and understanding the word, because I'm still learning. And hopefully, as trained as we are in understanding the word of God, we are not ever above contradiction. We work and we labor to be faithful, to honor the word, and to preach it. That's probably all the time that we've got today. And to listen to 20 minutes of us talking, I'm thankful for that. And we'll be picking up in the following weeks just other ways that how you can be engaged in the values of our church, from reverence to generous giving to being missional to being more reverential. So until next Friday, we'll look forward to seeing you here on Table Talk, if not on Sunday morning. We've got lots of space now. And so we hope that you're coming out on Sunday to receive the Word of God, which it really is, the Word that shapes you to be like Christ. Have a great Friday and a good weekend.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.